Hey everybody, and welcome to another mid-year video, because today I'm going to be talking about the books that I've read so far this year and my worst and favorites of those. So I'm going to go through the first 7 months. Am I going to do 7, or am I just going to stick to 6? I don't actually remember what I decided. Yeah, 7. I'm going to give you the best and the worst of the first 7 months of the year. So for each month, I'm going to make a decision about what the best and the worst book is that I read in those months. So starting off in January. January, to some extent, is a really great start to my year because I read 2 5-star reads in that month, and I also read my favorite book of the year so far in that month. But it also had some downers, I guess. So my worst book for the month of January is Crusades and Jeans by Thea Beckman. This is definitely a case of this book just not being targeted for me anymore. This is a book that is basically a book that I missed out on when I was a child. Because I don't actually remember for which readathon, but there was a prompt at that point in time to read a book that you had like missed out on in your childhood, and Crusades and Jeans is one of those. Because it's definitely one of the most read youth books within Belgium. And it's definitely a book that I know so many people who have read this book, who know so many people who have loved this book as well. But for me, this book just never really did it. Like, I don't even know whether I knew the concept when I was a kid, but it definitely never appealed to me. Those covers of the Thea Beckman books never appealed to me, so I never read a single one of them. And this is basically a sci-fi because it's a story about a modern day teenager. I mean, modern day, considering it was like written in the 70s or something like that, who travels back to the Middle Ages and takes part in a children's crusade towards the city of Jerusalem. And so it is very much one of those, young kid with all the knowledge of 1990s, no, 1970s or whatever, going back in time to the Middle Ages and being seen as this sort of like leader role, this like all-knowing, wise young guy, because there are a lot of skills that he has that he just knows based off of his knowledge, that, based off of the education that he has been able to get as a modern young kid, rather than the sort of like practical education that most of these medieval kids were getting, because most of them were just working all day long. I didn't really like it all that much because, it was just a simple adventure story. It lacked a lot of nuance, that lacked a lot of depth. This is definitely the type of thing that I can see children enjoying. Would I have enjoyed it? I think I would have enjoyed the like time travel aspects for it, but I don't actually think that I would have enjoyed the story necessarily all that much, just because, this really like crusades and all of those things were things that have never really interested me. And so probably that is also why as a kid I never showed interest in it. But then what was my best for January? My best book for January was Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is just an amazing, magical read. This is a book about the wife of Shakespeare, Agnes, who is basically this sort of like wise woman who can kind of see glimpses of the future by touching people. And so she has always seen this sort of like black hollow when she touches her husband Shakespeare. Together they end up having 2 children, and we know from the beginning that their youngest son, Hamlet, is going to be passing away. This is masterfully told. The prose in this is absolutely to die for. And I just absolutely devoured it, and I definitely loved it. It was very emotional, a difficult read, of course, considering the death of a child happening within it. But the whole sequence leading up to his passing is an anxiety inducing fever dream of a sequence, I guess, which, if you've seen the movie, is basically condensed down into like a very small scene that lacks any emotional impact. I think the movie does a really good job with the book overall, but that scene definitely to me was very strong and powerful within the book and kind of lacked any emotional depth within the movie adaptation. Next up, we get to the month of February. In the month of February, my worst book will have been The Names by Florence Knapp. This is a book that I basically just had really good expectations for, and it didn't really end up serving the purpose that I thought it was going to. So this is a alternate timeline type of story. So it's a story in which we're looking at what happens if the woman would have named her son differently. So we are looking at a household where the husband is emotionally and physically abusing his wife. And so he tells his wife to go and register their child's name at City Hall. And that is the point at which she has to make a decision. Either she's going to name him the way that either she's going to give him the same name as her husband's name, a name that has a lot of tradition and precedence within the family, or she's going to break that tradition and give him the name that her daughter wants him to have, or the name that she wants to give the kid. And so we look at these three different versions of life based on that. But ultimately, I felt like this felt flat and felt hollowed out because of the three timelines. Whereas I thought this could have been a really interesting exploration, but in the end, it just felt like we didn't have enough time with any of these characters in any of these timelines to really get to know them all that well, because we are dividing our time amongst different characters within each timeline. And we already have three timelines to contend with in a 300-page book. So basically have 100 pages per timeline, and then we're dividing that by 2 or 3 perspectives. And so it basically ended up being too ambitious for its execution. But my best book for that month is a book that I have here with me physically, and that is The Architect's Apprentice by Elif Shafak. So Elif Shafak is probably my favorite author at this point in time, and so it's no surprise that I've chosen this one to be my favorite book for the month of February. But it definitely wasn't a given, because this is probably one of my least favorite Elif Shafaks. But that being said, Elif Shafak at her worst, to say it like that, which is also not true, is still a really pleasant experience. I just feel like her amazing prose and writing style just, have to compensate for a story that just interested me a little bit less within this one. So in this one, we're following a young boy who, through circumstances, becomes apprenticed to the architect who is like hired by the Sultan. And so we look at a lot of the appointments that the Sultan gives to this architect, and so the development of his apprentices, but also he has fallen in love with the daughter of the Sultan, and so it's about that as well. And so, yeah, there were definitely elements about this that I enjoyed. I enjoyed the architecture and the discussion of sort of like the impact of the architecture on the surrounding people and on like being able to give jobs to the populace and things like that, but ultimately not my favorite. In the month of March, we go for my worst book, which might just get me cancelled, which is One Piece Volume 1 by Eiichiro Oda. So a first volume in a manga series very often disappoints. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, I'm automatically never going to have an interest in One Piece. But I will say that I have never really had much of an interest in One Piece. And the only reason I really chose to read this one was because I needed a pirate's prompt for something. Don't ask me what at this point in time, but there was something, a readathon, I guess, in which I was participating, for which I needed a pirate's prompt. And so this was the fit for that, and that's why I read it. But definitely this first volume didn't really convince me of anything, because a lot of times I think the story doesn't even really get started in the first manga volume. I make no promises about ever trying this. If I'm gonna try this, and most likely I'm gonna be watching like the show rather than continuing on with the actual manga series. I might continue with that if I were to then end up enjoying the show a lot. But I think my next step would be to watch the show. And me watching new to me shows is something that doesn't happen that often. So don't get your hopes up. Then in March, my best book was The Crimson Moth or The Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. And this is the first in a duology, I think, in which we're looking at a witch hunter and the witch that he's trying to catch. So basically, we have a witch hunter who is looking for this vigilante figure known as a Crimson Moth, because the Crimson Moth is somebody who is smuggling witches out of the realm. Now, our female protagonist is the Crimson Moth. She has these magical powers, and this is a world in which it used to be run by witches, and they definitely were abusing their powers. And actually, there's a little bit of a backstory involving our hunter and one of these queens. And so now that the queens have been taken down, the society has basically gone the total opposite end, trying to hunt down as many witches as possible because witches are all seen as evil at this point in time. But she is trying to get as many witches out of this city as possible, trying to smuggle as many of them out as possible. But she is doing so in a disguise because she's basically pretending to be just another vapid socialite, but using all of her connections and all of the access that she does has to try and get as many people as possible out. I really ate this one up. I was hoping to dive into the sequel pretty shortly afterwards, and I still haven't done so. But maybe that's just my excuse to be able to just go back and reread The Crimson Lot and just dive into the sequel straight from there at some point in time. It'll probably have to wait until my physical TBR is down a little bit more before I'll allow myself to do that, but it is something to look forward to in any case. And then we move on to the month of April. In the month of April, my worst book was The Wax Child by Olga Ravn. And I probably cannot really talk to you much about it because part of my issue with it is that I just felt like I didn't know what I was reading all of the time. This is a book that deals with witch trials in a Danish town, I believe. And we're looking at our protagonist who's basically forming this sort of like women's circle. It's not an actual witches circle, it's just the women's circle in which they share experiences with one another, share wisdom with one another, but the wisdom of women and women coming together in groups where men are not welcome has always been seen as suspicious, and so the authorities of the town are basically kind of there to, you know, try and catch her because there's also something involving it's something bad that happens to one of the women within the town, and then she, on her end, is so bitter because of what has happened that she places the blame on her. The entire story is kind of told through weird perspectives. Amongst others, it's told through the perspective of this wax doll that they've made, but also sometimes it's told through, like, I don't know, the sweat on the king's brow or stuff like that. So yeah, it wasn't really my thing. I've been meaning to read The Employees by Olga Ravn for a very long time because I've heard really good things about that. And I will say that I definitely now have a lot of hesitation before I'm going to be picking that one up because, yeah, it just really didn't work all that well for me in terms of the perspective and writing style. It is definitely possible that, you know, if it is not told through such an artsy perspective, that I would have a better time with The Employees. But for the time being, it's off of my TBR for a little bit. It's off of my one to read. In terms of the best for that month, I listened to The Dream Hotel by Leila Lalami. This is an anger-inducing book, and sometimes you need that, and that is definitely a book that can leave a very big impression. The Dream Hotel is a book about a future version of our world in which your dreams can basically be held against you. You basically have this sort of like threat assessment module that gives you a score based off of all of these different elements having to do with past behavior, but part of it is also having to do with the dreams that you have at night and your base instincts that are expressed through those dreams. And so there's this sort of like implant that a lot of people have decided to get because it helps them to sleep better. But so the downside to that is that it also allows this company to basically harvest their dreams, harvest the data that they get from these people. And so our protagonist is on her way back from a conference in London one day when she is stopped at airport security because her score has breached a certain level. And so she's taken to this holding facility in awaiting of her trial. This holding facility definitely plays fast and loose with human rights. And there's a lot going on there in terms of, you know, like the power play when it comes to the guards versus the people who are in this facility, because it is made clear multiple times that this is just a holding facility and that they have done no harm yet. So they are just awaiting trial to prove that they aren't criminals. And but they are very much treated as if they have already committed a crime, as if they have every, you know, like as if they deserve to be there, as if they deserve to be treated the way that they are. And a lot of things are held against them. They don't actually have to work, for example, but if they want any sort of like privileges, then they have to earn those. So a lot of them are holding a job in that holding facility in order to be able to pay for the visit, for calls to the family, for certain privileges, like a certain snack or something like that. Their family can send them money, but the longer that they are away, also the less likely that their family are to really still be supporting them. And then there's also this side narrative that comes in with a woman who is basically working for this dream company, who is also getting very much interested in one of the test subjects and is trying to use this technology to figure out if they can change the behavior of the people who are dreaming. In the month of May, my worst book is going to be A Darkness at Settlement by Raymond E. Feist. This book doesn't necessarily do a whole lot of things wrong. It is also a classic of the fantasy genre. And fantasy is a genre that I love, adore, read a lot of. But classic fantasy is definitely a style of fantasy that I'm happy we kind of grew out of. I definitely got introduced to fantasy through classic fantasy. In the early 2000s, that was mainly the fantasy that was still floating around at that point in time. So when I became old enough to be able to read the adult fantasy in the library, I was definitely consuming quite a fair bit of classic fantasy at that point. And I actually first read the Empire trilogy, which is a spin-off of this Magician trilogy by Raymond E. Feist. And yeah, the Magician trilogy is just, it doesn't really do for much for me. I don't really enjoy any of the characters. There's just one character called Jimmy the Hands, who were introduced at some point and who was like a very big part in book 2, who I got to enjoy quite a lot. And so book 3 to me is the biggest disappointment out of this series, because at that point in time, it was clear to me that I just didn't care about this trilogy. The only character I cared about was Jimmy the Hand, and there was just never enough of him. The whole series should have been about Jimmy the Hand, and then maybe I would have enjoyed it more. But yeah, so this isn't like I hated this. This is just like I checked out, and I should have checked out physically earlier than I did. But I did continue on to finish the entire trilogy. But do I know anything? Do I remember anything about that third book? No, I remember the second one vividly, but not the third one. And then the best book in that month is The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson, which is a fantasy contest type of story in which we have this empire where the ruler is basically replaced every so many years, and then there's a competition held in which like each different clan can send one representative, and then they go through a series of tests and trials in order to figure out the next leader. And our protagonist is a woman from the Raven clan who is not actually all that interested in being one of the contenders. However, she is kind of enroped into this when the actual Raven contender, I think she was a Raven contender, right? When she is killed. And so she has to go into this trial now, and now she has to go into this trial in her stead and try and figure out who killed her. In the wider scope of things, we also have a past occurrence that's going to heavily influence many of the decisions and the dynamics within this story. And that is the killing of the daughter of a rebel who tried to overthrow the emperor at some point in time. And her brother basically fed her to the lion, so to speak. And our protagonist was basically the person who signed her execution order, which then brought about a rift in her relationship with her best friend. And so both she, the brother who betrayed his sister, and her best friend are contenders in this particular iteration of the competition to figure out who's going to be the next ruler. And so these events are going to tie in closely with the events of the current timeline. Really enjoyed this one a whole lot, ate this stuff up, and I really enjoyed how that original story that we're introduced to within the first chapter of the exile of this girl becomes such a central part to this entire plot and becomes something that we will be harkening back to time and time again. In June, we have a worst book of the month that I really didn't want to put there, but basically that is, the competition wasn't weak enough for anything else, and that is The House Witch Tree by Dellenbach. I absolutely adore The House Witch and The House Witch 2, and definitely The House Witch, the first book, was a strong contender for best book of the month in which I read it. I just don't remember when I read it, and I'm guessing there were just stronger contenders in those months. If I read The House Witch, for example, in the month of The Architect's Apprentice, then The House Witch would have overruled that, for example. But Yeah, unfortunately, the third book just didn't foster the strengths, in my opinion, of the first two books. So what I really loved about the first two books just wasn't what the third book was giving. Let's say it like that. So House Witch is a trilogy in which we're looking at a protagonist called Finley Ash Owen, who is a witch who is also who is a witch who has taken on a job being the cook at the castle. He is trying to hide his magical powers because witches are very much looked down upon within this world, but he's also the type of character that no matter how much he tries to shy away from people and to just be out on his own, he cannot help but become the center of attention, become embroiled in all of these plots. And while he might be introducing a high level of chaos, he's also introducing chaos that will lead to a lot of solutions, resolutions. He's an adorable character who I love with all my heart. He's somebody who's very much there to protect the innocent and those who perhaps need a little bit of a needs who and those who actually need somebody to stand up for themselves because they on their own have become so small due to past events and past disappointments that they need a little bit of a champion to fight for them, and Finley will always be there to do so. And so I loved this series a lot, but the third book just goes a little bit too far into a negative storyline that I didn't necessarily want to dive into all that much, and the plot just became so much bigger than the first book was, and I think I really liked the low stakes element of the first book, maybe even the second book, but the third book definitely leaves behind the low stakes part and becomes high stakes, and that just didn't work as well for me. My favorite book that month was actually a difficult one, and so once again, if I would have read The House Witch in this month, then it probably would have been my best book for that month, because my favorite book is going to be By Blood, by Salt by J.L. Odom. And I don't know, I still don't know my feelings about this book all that well. Have yet to dive into the sequel, and I should do it as fast as possible because this takes its damn time, okay? Very slow development, very like nuanced, character driven, and I feel like I'm already forgetting so much essential stuff for me to be able to fully enjoy the sequel. But I also feel like I don't want to dive into the sequel at this point in time. Like it was such a chore to get through this book that now I'm like, oof. But that sounds so negative. Well, whereas I also think that this one was a fascinating fantasy to read, was very different from most of the fantasies that I've read. This is a military fantasy in which we're looking at a colonizer society who basically has a emperor at the reign, let's say. His brother is basically being steered by his advisor in a certain way so that he can gain a little bit more power and more control because his advisor basically kind of wants to overthrow the current emperor. And in order for them to gain more prestige and more of a footing with the military branch of the society, they kind of introduce this idea of setting out into the desert and trying to find these sort of like mythical devils that are supposed to live over there. They hire this military team who is run by a well-established captain, but he has somebody in his employ who basically shouldn't be in the higher ranks of the army and officially isn't, but practically speaking, he is very much the second in command. And that is somebody from the populace who has basically been overrun by this colonizing force. He is somebody who, because of his origins, because of his race, is very much looked down upon, should be given the shittier jobs, but he's somebody who's also really a natural born leader, a capable, moral leader who knows his value, knows to get stuff done, and is like a really competent leader at that as well. And so this is the setup. And then we're moving into the final month so far, the month of July. My worst book for the month of July is The Soul Catchers by Naoko Higashi. This is a book that I just feel should have been either way longer or should have just focused on one story, because this is a collection of snippets, I would even just call them. And the concept is basically that when you pass away, you can send your soul back down to Earth to inhabit a inanimate object. and then you can basically observe the world from there. So a lot of people will choose to go back to inhabit an object that is close to somebody that they have loved. And so the book is all about grief, about dealing with your own death and with unresolved issues, but also about the grief of the people that have been left behind and them moving on with their lives. And we get so many different stories that it just starts, that there's just no depth possible. It explores the wide range of possible emotions, but it explores all of these in such a small, quick way that we don't really get to have any depth in any of these stories. We do get to see a plethora of circumstances, and some of these stories definitely I felt like were a little bit more, questionable than some others. But yeah, ultimately, it just felt like there was no real possibility to get to any sort of like real emotion because of how little time we spent with all of these different scenarios. And then the best book for the month of July is going to be Snake Eater by T. Kingfisher, which is a book that I definitely was very much charmed with and fell in love with. So this is a book about a woman called Selena who is in a relationship where she is emotionally manipulated to some extent. She's very much definitely looked like made to feel as if she is an imposition to the people around her, as if she is always saying the wrong thing, as if she is always embarrassing those around her, as if she doesn't know how to speak to people, how to deal with circumstances, how to get by on her own, and that she needs him for everything in her life. And so she has finally taken the step to get out of this relationship. And so she decides to go and visit her aunt because she hasn't seen her aunt in a very long time. However, when she arrives in the remote desert town where her aunt lives, it turns out that she has passed away over a year ago. And so very much disappointed in the circumstances and fearing that she will have to call her ex in order to have him help buy her a train ticket out of there, she decides to stay a little bit longer until she can get a train ticket home herself. And so this book will see her coming into her own, learning to take up space, learning to come into herself and into her emotions, her actions, figuring out that she can do stuff on her own or that she can do stuff with the help of others around her, that she doesn't necessarily have to rely on this one person, and that asking for help from the people around her isn't necessarily an imposition, isn't necessarily putting people out, isn't a burden to those around her, but also it is about her finding a place, a home for herself. However, somebody else might have different feelings about who belongs in that house and whether she belongs there. And so yes, this is a found family story and a find yourself type of story of a woman coming into herself and learning to love herself again, learning to trust herself and her decisions and her feelings and her communication skills again, and the wonderful people that she meets along the way and who help her on that journey. And so, yeah, those were my best and my worst so far for the year of 2026. We have 5 months left in which to read a ton of amazing new books. Unfortunately, there will also be a few more disappointments and maybe a few actual rage reads as well, but let's hope for more of the former and less of the latter. So let me know if you are watching this video what your favorite book so far has been in the year, or what your biggest disappointment has been so far. But so yeah, with that, I'm going to end this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it and see you guys for the next one. Bye!